Comfort. She's one of our distinguished panelists today who's joining us. Thank you. She has a certificate in publishing from Yale University and a bachelor's degree in political science and equity studies from the University of Toronto. As the Center for Diversity's manager at Mosaic, right now, she is essential to developing and enforcing internal rules that support inclusion and diversity in the workplace. She makes sure that these rules are not just created, but also implemented. A lot of time, we ourselves create rules in our life. Oh, I have to wake up at 6 a.m. in the morning, but I never wake up. But she makes sure that the rules are followed, but bigger rules in terms of inclusion and diversity. So Comfort assumes external responsibility for providing clients with diversity, equity, and inclusion training, which is very important. For any new immigrant, this inclusion training is very important. Thank you. Comfort is the first Black woman named to the Vancouver Police Board by the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. She represents areas that have historically experienced excessive policing and inadequate safety. Comfort has a foundation in international development and has contributed significantly to a number of projects in Asia and Africa that have improved institutional efficiency.
Comfort Farupa, I have to always remember that because it took me 2 years after getting married to like remember, like okay, you know. But yeah, no, 2 years, man. I still have to think. It is hard for women. I don't think we talk about that, but it's a really, if you choose to change your name, it's a really difficult transition. In any case, Comfort moved to BC in 2020. I have so many things I want to talk about, but I'm gonna sort of walk you through my history, I guess, in Canada. My dad immigrated to Canada in 1985 as then a PhD student at McGill. He was going between Canada and Nigeria at the time, which is where I'm from. And in 1989, 5 months after I was born, he came to get my mom and I and brought us over to Montreal, which is where I grew up initially for the first 12 years of my life. In getting to Montreal, one of the laws back then was that if your parents did not immigrate to Canada before 1965, you had to go to a French-speaking school, private school. So those were your options. So initially, my parents sent us to public school because as new immigrants, how were they going to afford public school, private school? And so we did that, and that didn't last 3 months because my dad, who was an educator himself, wanted to be involved in our education, but couldn't because of the language barrier. And so they took whatever money they had and put us in a private school called The Study. In my class in the early 90s was the then Prime Minister's granddaughter, Jacqueline Denardet, who was Jean Chrétien's granddaughter. I sat in class with Brittany Molson, whose father owns the Molson Company and whose grandfather founded that. I had classmates who today are married to the Prince of Denmark and all kinds of people. I say that to say that we were the absolute poorest people at that school. We had zero business being there, but our parents, being Nigerian, put us there. Now, that presented some good things, but also some bad things. And I think some of the most important life lessons would come out of my early education at that school. I think back to one of my earliest experiences with racism was actually when I was in the 3rd grade. Every break, I would come out during recess and I'd want to play with the kids. So I'd go out and I would see kids playing, and I clearly was not, I was one of 4 Black kids, my sister and I being 2 of the 4. The other 2 were mixed race, and their father owned a hair salon that did Whitney Houston and Brandy's hair. So again, economic levels here. And so I would go outside and I'd want to play with the kids, and I would say, est-ce que je peux jouer avec vous? Can I play with you? And they would say, demande Jacqueline. So ask Jacqueline. No, demande Chloé. Ask Chloé. And they would go around in a circle so that the last kid could tell me, no, je peux pas jouer avec nous. No, you can't play with us. And this would happen every single break until I started just sitting by myself. So one day after school, we're in the car, my mom would come to get us. And we get to the house, and I tell my mom that I have something I want to say to her. She goes, what's up? And I say, Mom, I don't want to go to this school anymore. I don't feel like I belong there. I feel very uncomfortable. And at this time, I'm probably 6, 7, or maybe 8. And my mom switches off the engine. I'll never forget this conversation. And she says to me, Comfort, this school, and it's crazy to think that I probably didn't understand it then or take it for what it was, but this conversation has never left me. So this school is basically a reflection of what the world is going to look like for you going forward. And you need to understand that if everyone else is studying for 5 hours, you study for 10. If everybody else is going to put in X amount of work, you got to put in 3 times the amount of work. Earn your space and never feel like you don't belong in that place. And I'm so grateful that a woman with only 5 years of experience in Canada at that time had the foresight to be able to encourage me to stay in a place where I didn't belong, because that would ultimately shape how I feel in spaces where I don't belong today. They mentioned earlier that I'm the first Black person in 133 years to be a director for the Vancouver Police Department. And I find that really interesting, or the board. I find that very interesting because how I got there was I had participated in a Citizens Academy where they bring 20 people every year to come and experience policing and see what it's like. And when we got to the 7th floor, which is the executive floor, there was a wall of all the executives and all the senior management. And there wasn't anybody browner than a paper bag on that wall. In fact, a paper bag is probably too brown of a benchmark. And I said it out loud. I said, why are there no brown people on this wall? And I had no idea that had gone from the 7th floor to the entire membership. And everyone had heard that I had made that comment. And so in the aftermath of George Floyd, my big question was, well, who hires the police? And that's when I discovered that police departments are governed by boards, and the boards are appointed by the province. And so I began what was a 13-month background check for everything to become part of the board, and eventually after 13 months, I was appointed officially to the board. To go from that girl to go from that girl at the study who didn't feel comfortable in her 3rd grade class to being a person, a Black woman in the aftermath of George Floyd, to sit on a board, I think there's a direct parallel between that. And I want to speak to that because a lot of people in this room are raising young children coming through school systems where they are facing racism. And a lot of our parents who are immigrants don't have experiences with racism, and so they're not really able to, and when I say don't have experiences, I say this in the sense that before my parents came to immigrate to Canada, they had no knowledge that they were Black. They were simply people, right? When you are one of 200 million Black people, being Black is not a thing. There's no discussion about race. There's tribalism, there's all other kinds of issues, but the concept of race, the introduction to your Blackness, happens when you get here. And so they're still exploring what that means. But what happens is that the children who are now in schools here are dealing with it on a level that their parents have absolutely no experience with. And so part of what I'm going to talk about today is the importance of, if you don't understand what your children are going through, not dismissing it, and really creating safe spaces for them to communicate, because it is very difficult to be a minority child in schools. You heard some of the things that Garrison described in terms of the names that he was called. My mom always had the best comebacks for us to go back and tell kids. But I could do that because my personality was such that very little got to me. But it was different from my sister. A lot of things did get to her. And so you had to take different approaches. But I wanted to give that context because I think that's really important. One of the big lessons for me growing up as a Nigerian child in Canada, before it was cool to be Nigerian, was that every Halloween, I really wanted to wear Nigerian clothes as what I thought was a costume. And I remember one year I decided that I was going to dress in traditional attire as my Halloween costume. And my dad, on seeing us prepare, was like, there's absolutely no way you're going to wear that. That is not a costume. It is traditional garb. It is traditional attire. It is to be worn with respect and dignity and not to be mocked. And you know, these are things that you hear as a child and you just can't process, because it's like, why can't I just wear this, what is clearly a costume, to go to school? But I'm so appreciative for that lesson, because before it was cool, like I said, to be Nigerian, my parents instilled in us a sense of pride around our culture, around our traditions. And that's where, when you talk about history and understanding who you are, it's so important. Because I see a lot of young immigrant families try to sort of separate from that culture and that history and try to immediately become whatever it is to be Canadian. And I feel like in that is a loss of identity. And in no place that I've lived in Canada has that been more clear to me than in British Columbia, where I feel so deeply an erasure of Blackness. When I see our young Black children, because I grew up in Montreal and Toronto, where there's such deep Black communities and networks. Whether you're Caribbean or you're African, you know exactly where you're from, and if you get in trouble before you even get to your house, Lord God, you know, very much feels like an African village because everyone's gonna whoop you on the way home. So by the time you get home, you're just looking for mercy at that point. But I grew up in a very African environment. So my school was very white, but home was very African. And my mother would tell us when we got home, when you walk in through these doors, you're in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And when you leave these doors, you're back in Canada. So what, you know, and when I tell you, that was literally our home. And I remember she yelled at my sister one day, and Grace was like, I'm gonna call the police. And my mom's like, I'll do you one better. I will call the police. And my mother called 911 and said, please come and collect my daughter, because if you don't come and collect her, I'm going to beat her, then I'm gonna end up in jail, and I don't have time for that. I have another child to take care of. When the police came to our house, they looked at my sister, they said, do you know the neighborhood that you live in? Do you know how lucky you are to be in a home like this? If your mother ever has to call us again, you're gonna be dealing with us. And that was the last time that my sister made that threat. But my mother called the police herself and waited on the porch for the police to arrive. And these are all like very funny things now that we look back at them as anecdotal stories. But they were such important moments, such pivotal moments in the life of a young Black child. Because my mom always said, it's either I discipline you or the system will. You gotta make your decision. And I was so grateful for a mom who chose time and time again that she was going to be our disciplinarian. Heaven, you know, thank God for that. And so British Columbia, I look at a lot of young Black children growing up in this province, across the province. And I feel so separated from the issues that they're facing because I didn't have to deal with erasure per se as a young Black African. I had other issues to deal with, like people calling me monkey or whatever it was, and other kinds of things like that. Or your parents, you know, came to Canada, how did they get to Canada? I mean, white adults would ask me, how did your parents get to Canada? My dad always said, tell them we swang from trees. Always, consistently, just we swang from trees. And so, you know, and they would be so fascinated by that. So, my goodness, like, wow, really, how? You know? Between that and Americans who are shocked that you're Canadian and you don't live in an igloo, I don't know what's more shocking. You know, I remember going to Barack Obama's inauguration, the first one, and we were 15 million strong at National Mall, and I slept on someone's back. Everyone slept on someone's back because we slept outside that night. And when we woke up, people would be from Georgetown University. They'd be like, you from Canada? Do you know Drake? No. You know, you're at Georgetown? You know, so something between, you know, between that experience and, you know, white Canadians asking me how my parents got here, I think there's very similar experiences there. So I think about racism, I think about that, and then I think about being a high school student in grade 10 and deciding that I wanted to go to the University of Toronto. I looked, what is the top university in Canada? My dad was already at McGill. He wanted us to go to McGill. There was no way we were going to McGill. Reason being, when we were 9 and 10 years old, my father saw us typing with one finger and he was like, oh no, you guys are gonna have to learn how to type properly. He gave us his PhD dissertation. Now he's a geologist, so every word is 13, 14 characters, right? Gave us his PhD dissertation, 400 or 500 pages strong, and said he would pay us a nickel for every page that we transcribed. And this sounded like a fair deal initially until we realized we couldn't buy anything with that money, and so we put 3 pages in. But you go sort of from that to going to, you know, so I knew for sure I wasn't going to university with my father at all, because he would be at our lectures, just overzealous. So my sister and I were like, we're not going to McGill, what's the next best thing? And we had decided University of Toronto was a better option actually. And so, you know, my dad was like, fine, go to U of T. And I went to my guidance counselor and I said, you know, I want to go to University of Toronto, what do I need to do to go there? And Mr. Brown, I will say his name, laughed at me and he was like, comfort, like, University of Toronto is the hardest school to get into. Here's what I propose, a 2+2 program. Do 2 years in community college, specifically Seneca College. And then after 2 years at Seneca College, you can go to York. And maybe for your postgraduate, you can go to University of Toronto. It would take years before I realized that this is called streamlining. There's actually a term for it, and Ontario has a very high rate of it. And I suspect that now that British Columbia is starting to take that race-based data, that we'll see that that's happening here as well. But I was being streamlined away from university level courses, actually initially to take apprenticeship courses, then go to college, then maybe go to university. And here I was confused. I've come to you with a plan. I'm asking you to create a pathway for me to get to that plan. And you're telling me, no, you can't do that, instead you're gonna do this. And so I believe that my privilege in that moment was that I had a father who had already gone to a McGill University, And so I have the confidence to be able to say, no, I can do this. But I can't imagine what it would be like if I was first generation to go to university. So I already knew, being Nigerian, that I didn't have a choice but to go to university, so your entire plan makes no sense to me. I have 3 career choices, and none of them are what you proposed. And so I basically decided on my own that I was only going to apply to one school. I think you could pay $125 at the time and apply to 3 universities or 3 programs at one school. I decided that I was going to apply to 1 university and 3 programs at one school. I was, God damn it, I was going to University of Toronto. And I got in. And that for me was the beginning of what my mom had told me back in the day, which is you just got to prove them wrong. There's nothing to feel, you can feel bad, but when you're done feeling bad, you need to get up and you got to do exactly what they said you cannot. And so, you know, I went to University of Toronto to spite somebody, and I'm really, really glad that I did that. And I'm always talking to young people who are consistently being streamlined out of universities. And so many of my friends with young black children, particularly young black boys, and now that I have an 18-month-old black boy, my sense of my attention to this is so high because so many of my friends with black children are hearing their kids come home and say, I don't want to go to university. University doesn't make any sense. But the people who are telling them that, their kids are in university.
Yeah, exactly.
So how does that work? What's going on here?
Exactly.
And so my final sort of experience, which is the most recent experience for me, was in 2022. This story actually went viral. I was pregnant in 2022 with my first child. At 19 weeks, my water broke. And so I went to BC Women's, and they were like, oh, your water broke, we're so sorry, we're gonna have to do a D&C, which is an abortion essentially, and terminate your pregnancy. I'm like, hold on, what? I just bought my entire nursery, literally 24 hours ago, because you guys told me once you get to this particular week, you're in the clear. And so I literally bought my nursery 2 days ago. I'm, what are you talking about? Just in total shock. And with almost, like, I would say carelessness, right? With no sort of attention to what my medical history is. The fact that I had PCOS and expected post-marriage that it would take me 5 or 10 years to even get pregnant. And it took me 3 months after getting married, when I'd been told my whole life it would take me at least 5 years. So I finally got pregnant. I'm in this moment of joy, and you're telling me in a flash of a moment that I have to have an abortion. Well, first of all, I need information, like is the baby's heart beating, what's going on? When I tell you that what would happen would become provincial news, it's just beyond me. Got to the hospital, told them I wasn't ready to have an abortion. I wanted to know how much water was left. I had information that I needed to know. I was told basically that there was less than a 1% chance that I was going to make it to viability. So if you don't know, in British Columbia and the United States, pregnancy viability is 23 weeks. If your baby is delivered before 23 weeks, essentially they're put on your chest until they die. It's called palliative care. So they just wait for the baby's organs to close. They're not going to be admitted to NICU. So being at 19 weeks, you know, when your water breaks, typically, statistically, there's a 95% chance that you're going to deliver that baby within 3 days. So I was told there's no way you're going to make it to viability. The likelihood of you making it a week is 0 or 1%. The idea that you'd make it 3 or 4. But in my heart, I had a conviction that my baby's going to make it. And so I was like, I'm not ready for this termination. I want to continue. They admitted me to the hospital, and for 40 hours, because I was in chronic pain, for 40 hours, no doctor came to see me.
Wow.
And it would take me, because I'm on the board of the Vancouver Police, it would take me emailing the mayor at the time, Kennedy Stewart, to say, I'm in the hospital, I've been here for 38 hours at the time of the email. My nurses have done everything to try and get a doctor in this room, what do I do? It was Sunday night at around 9 p.m. I did not expect the mayor to read it. I didn't even expect him to respond. I knew that they had said while I was pregnant, if you need anything, reach out to us. But I didn't think that that meant anything. 9:30 p.m. on a Sunday night, I get an email back from the mayor that he has just spoken to the senior administrator of the hospital, and they're going to handle it immediately. And between my email to the mayor and my first set of doctors arriving was about 30 minutes.
Wow.
And there were about 9 or 10 doctors. There was an army that walked into my room. One of whom I then said that he's my experience manager. His job is to ensure that I have a positive experience going forward. I laugh at it now, but it's actually not funny. Because we know that in the United States, black women are 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy. And we know that because the data is collected. I'm not surprised. I would not be surprised if the data is the same for Canada. We've just started collecting data. I'm very interested to see what those numbers look like, because where the data has started to come out, Canada's statistics mirror the United States. So in Ontario, Black and Indigenous students are 8 times more likely to be suspended from school, identical to Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. In Ontario and Nova Scotia, where the data has been gathered, Black and Brown students are more likely to be streamlined away from university. Same statistics in the United States. So now that we're taking race-based data in health, I'm looking forward to see what those numbers are. I know I gotta wrap this up, but my son made it to 29 weeks, so 10 weeks. He's alive, oh, very well, walking, hitting all his milestones. Yeah. But I'll say all that to say that where race and this discussion of race is so critical amongst everything that we've talked about is in the area of education, because so many of our brilliant minds, our innovators, are systematically being turned away from higher education. And in health, where Black and Indigenous people are literally being ignored to death. And because they don't have access to a mayor or a person of influence, they are sitting, I did 40 hours, only God knows what other people are doing in that hospital. And I know that it's a problem, because when I was in hospital, nurses would tell, particularly Indigenous women, when they were not being listened to by their doctors, go to room 3. And they would, that was my room. And once they would come to my room and they would report a situation, I was the patient advocate. When I tell you I sat through so many patient, family, doctor meetings, people would refuse their rounds until comfort was in the room. And so literally from 9 a.m. till 12, I would go from room to room to room, because families would ask me to, and that tells you that there's a problem. Because patients didn't feel empowered to speak up. Families could not understand what the heck the doctors were telling them. And nobody felt like they could be brave enough to speak up to doctors. And so I was the one creating medical plans on behalf of patients. This is not a joke. I'm legendary at BC Women. Woo! And then that continued. Today I sit on a council that was created for NICU families by BC Women's, where we sit and we're now looking at how do we change the patient experience, because that was ridiculous that I had to deal with those things. And so I close in saying education, healthcare are 2 of the most consequential areas where race is impacting us. And the last thing I want to say, because I am looking at the diversity in this room, is where Canada also needs to start focusing on race discussions is the prejudice that's happening amongst racialized minorities. I have experienced more racism. I'm not going to call it racism because that requires systemic power. I have experienced more prejudice and bias at the hands of other racialized people than I have white people. Wow. I have been required to provide more identification in a bank where all of the employees were Chinese than I have ever been required where all the employees are white. And I think if we don't look at this secondary level of prejudice, we're missing a very big part of the conversation. Because these are our teachers, these are our bankers, they're the ones approving my loans, they're the ones deciding whether or not I get a mortgage. And so, yeah, I want to talk about the history of white systemic oppression and all of that. But more consequentially, I need to understand what's going on with the stratification of the races and why some of us have decided that we're more powerful than others and how that's affecting my life and the life of people that look like me. The end. Thank you.